You're listening to Arsenal for Democracy, episode 393, recorded on Sunday, August 22nd, 2021. I'm your host, Bill Humphrey. Joining me on the line from New York City is Kelley. Hi, Kelley.
Hi, Bill. Thanks for having me.
Joining me on the line from Idaho, as always, is Rachel. Hi, Rachel.
Hi, Bill. Hi, Kelley.
This week we're talking about the first of two topics from 100 years ago in August of 1921, and this one is about FDR, Franklin Delano Roosevelt, becoming disabled for life in August of 1921, 100 years ago. But before we talk about what happened a century ago, I wanted to first discuss FDR's life before this happened, as he was a fairly significant political figure before this, and I think that a lot of people don't necessarily realize that. So who was he before then? Well, Franklin D. Roosevelt, obviously a relative of former President Theodore Roosevelt, who had served relatively recently before this. FDR was a New York State senator, briefly, elected in 1910, where he earned a reputation of being against the Tammany Hall Democratic machine, and he focused on farm legislation, which would come up later during the New Deal. He then left for Washington in 1913 to join the Woodrow Wilson administration as Assistant Secretary of the U.S. Navy. That had previously been Teddy Roosevelt's political launchpad as well. FDR briefly tried to run for the Democratic nomination for U.S. Senate from New York in 1914, but he was unsuccessful and remained at the Navy position. After World War I, he survived the 1918 flu pandemic and began the Navy's unexpected pivot to sea-based aviation, which became crucial later in winning World War II. In 1920, the Democratic Party was in chaos, as we've talked about on some previous episodes, because Woodrow Wilson's inner circle was concealing his debilitating stroke and refused to allow any major candidates to step up to run for president in delusional hopes of electing him to a third term. Wilson's team actually continued this active sabotage of strong candidates, even from his own cabinet, right up to the convention. With the first-string candidates seemingly out of the picture, or at least not guaranteed to win, Roosevelt put himself forward and tried to assemble a junior dream team to run for president with Herbert Hoover as his running mate. Hoover had recently come to prominence globally for organizing emergency food distribution to European civilians during and after World War I. Unfortunately, Hoover, who himself had presidential aspirations, was politically inexperienced and openly declared himself a Republican, which not only ended FDR's plan, but also actually ended Hoover's plans by allowing more experienced Republicans like Ohio Senator Warren Harding to outmaneuver Hoover without risking him running as a Democrat. Hoover would instead end up as Commerce Secretary in the next administration and then be elected president in time to face the 1929 market crash. So in 1920, then age 38, FDR abandoned his first presidential plans and instead began lobbying to put himself in contention as the vice presidential running mate. The Democratic Convention struggled through 44 ballots to pick progressive Ohio Governor James Cox as their presidential candidate. Cox quickly endorsed Roosevelt as his running mate pick, party leaders concurred, and convention delegates were happy to pick a Roosevelt for name value, and he was elected VP unopposed after about half a dozen others withdrew to save time and effort. And one fun fact here, one of the other would-be vice presidential candidates who pulled out of the race ended up being implicated as one of the bribers in the Teapot Dome scandal of the next administration. You can listen to our episode about that. Cox and Roosevelt went on to be obliterated in the November 1920 election by a 26-point margin with no northern or western states carried. This was the worst defeat to present day in the history of contested U.S. presidential elections. This loss for Cox and Roosevelt came despite an unusually vigorous campaign schedule and reasonable efforts to distance themselves from the mounting public backlash to the late-period Wilson administration's foreign policy, especially on Ireland and League of Nations commitments. And U.S. economic or labor instability and ensuing crackdowns obviously weren't popular either. This came despite attempts by Cox and Roosevelt on the Democratic ticket to refocus domestically, like the Harding campaign was. Ultimately, Irish-American and German-American voters overwhelmingly boycotted or crossed over to vote Republican in reaction to Wilson's domestic persecutions, which we talked about on a bonus episode about the American Protective League, and reversals abroad on Irish independence policy, which I didn't know about until I was researching this episode, and I think we might need to circle back and talk a little bit more about that, because that seems to have been a pretty significant factor, and there were even some pretty huge attempts by Irish Republicans and maybe the Irish government to try to influence the U.S. election. And the way that this, again, influence, if it happened, came was Irish-American non-participation or crossover voting. Anyway, and between these two factors of the Irish and German voters, this ensured a massive Democratic defeat. Obviously, there was a lot of things working against them, but that definitely racked up the score, basically, and led to that aforementioned worst defeat in U.S. history. Republicans also outspent the Democrats about 4-1. I'm sure that didn't help either. So anyway, as I said, 26-point loss. And of course, as we know, Roosevelt would make a political comeback 8 years later in the 1928 New York governor election by a 1% margin. And then he would be elected 4 times to the presidency. And some historians, as well as Roosevelt's circle itself at the time, would argue that the 1920 campaign built up his national profile, even if it was a failure. And interestingly, Cox's legacy lives on through the media conglomerate bearing his name. And he also, very notably, was a super enthusiastic supporter of Roosevelt's future campaigns, which was not necessarily true of a lot of the other Democratic leaders and unsuccessful presidential candidates of the time period. However, Roosevelt's career very nearly ended in the early 1920s, not only because of his crushing political defeat in late 1920, but also because of the defining life event of August 1921, less than a year later, his paralysis and permanent disability. So that brings us up to today's topic. As Kelley will explain, it's hard for us to imagine the Roosevelt of 1920 running for vice president, able to walk around, given his later public image. But his situation shifted dramatically 100 years ago this month. So Kelley, could you tell us a little bit about what happened with Roosevelt becoming permanently disabled?
Of course. So at the age of 39, in August 1921, FDR contracted what doctors believe was polio and lost the use of his legs while on vacation on a Canadian island off the coast of Maine. It was quite unusual for someone of this age to contract polio, and where he contracted it is still a topic of debate. Many people believe it was at the Boy Scout camp he had been at the week before, as polio sort of will stay in your system for about 2 weeks before it manifests. He began getting sick on August 10th and remained in the hospital until October 25th. It's impossible to sort of overstate his illness during this time. The initial onset of the disease really could have killed him and nearly did. He had no use of his bladder. He had to be had a catheter inserted. Doctors initially thought he might have some sort of blood clot, so they instructed Eleanor to be massaging him until they realized it wasn't a blood clot, it was probably polio, and the massage was causing further damage. Because he was 39, which is much older than the typical age of polio onset, it did take doctors quite a few weeks to figure out what was going on and how to treat him appropriately. He had, one of the symptoms was that his skin was so sensitive that even a slight breeze really sent him into distress and great pain. And he had to make this very treacherous journey from this island off the coast of Maine to New York to receive treatment. And you can only imagine the pain of traveling by boat and then by train when one has this sort of sensitivity. But he ended up in New York for treatment and remained in the hospital until October 25th. He continued to believe that warm water and exercise would help him regain the use of his legs, and he set lofty physical goals for himself, like walking down his driveway, which was a 1/4 mile long. He never, we'll talk about this throughout the episode, but he was not a person who lost mobility in his lower half and then said, okay, this is my life now. He really, I think, believed to his core that he just needed to find the right treatment to regain mobility. And so he spent much of the next few years trying out different treatments, really believing that if he had enough warm air and physical exercise that he could sort of heal himself. And so between 1925 and 1928, Franklin would spend more than half of his time, 116 of the 208 weeks, away from home, struggling to find a way to regain his feet, wrote biographer Jeffrey Ward. Eleanor was with him just 4 of those 116 weeks, and his mother was with him for only 2. His children hardly saw him. So this was a really impossible to overstate the significance of this event on his life, as it really set him on a track to spending all his time either like trying to get his political hat back in the ring or trying to heal himself. And it came at great cost to his sort of personal relationships. It's no secret that him and Eleanor were not in good graces at that point. 2 years earlier, Eleanor had learned that he was cheating on her with her personal secretary. And so it's not like this was a happy marriage to begin with, but it is significant that FDR spent more than half of these 4 years away from his entire family. One thing that I was surprised to learn, there is current debate in the medical community about whether it was truly polio or actually Guillain-Barré syndrome. The truth is that it really could have been either of these. There's no way to know for certainty 100 years later, and that there was no cure for either in 1921. But this sort of, the polio aspect was significant because he and the public believed he had contracted polio. That influenced policy on polio. He spoke about polio, and obviously no one at the time was speaking of the Guillain-Barré syndrome since he had been diagnosed with polio. There has been folklore on both sides about whether FDR was open with his illness or not. A book by Hugh Gregory Gallagher, published in the 1980s, called FDR's Splendid Deception, sort of overstated the extent to which FDR tried to cover up his disability, and that falsehood spread to some extent. It also isn't true that FDR was totally open about his disability. He did go to great lengths to deliver speeches while standing at a podium, holding onto sort of railroad cars as he waved to people in the crowd, or his wife waved to people in the crowd. There really was a lot of thought and energy put into how he would present in the media in particular, making sure he wasn't photographed in his wheelchair. Only a few photographs to date exist of him in his wheelchair. He had sort of a friendly agreement with the press that they would not photograph him this way. He did not think it was appropriate for the president to be photographed in a wheelchair or show any sort of physical disability. And so while he was open with the fact that he had polio and had lost use of his legs, and this was evidenced in sort of the hundreds of letters that people with disabilities sent to him each year, evidence in newspaper mentions of it. Even in FDR's own speeches, he occasionally referred to it. And so it was not a secret that he had polio, but really what was a secret was the way in which it still persisted in affecting his life. I can't help but see how that relates to his belief that he could heal himself, and if he only did the right amount of swimming or physical activity, that he could fix this. It was important to him that the public perception was that he had overcome this disease and he was a champion, and not that it was something that he was still suffering from. And so I think that relates greatly to the way in which he both acknowledged it. It was well known in the public, but also he he put great effort into how he would present physically, making people comfortable, using his sort of head as to gesture during speeches rather than his hands while he clutched onto the podium, and modifications like that. FDR named his disability himself in a speech in Rochester, New York, when he was talking about the needs of disabled children in the state of New York, and he even mentioned himself. He says, "I have myself been through this ordeal, and I am a symbol of what can happen when people with disabilities are strongly supported." I think this quote is particularly insightful because he uses himself as a symbol of success amongst people with disabilities, but he also names the support that he received, and that sort of support for people with disabilities was also evident in some of his policy wishes, although not all of those wishes came to fruition during his presidency, which we'll touch upon in a moment. There are a number of sort of remnants of his legacy, which still very much exists today when it comes to polio. one does not simply contract this disease at 39 years old, spend much of their life in a wheelchair, and have there be no sort of residual effects. On January 3rd, 1938, Roosevelt founded the National Foundation for Infantile Paralysis, or polio, in order to support young children with polio and fund research against the disease. Roosevelt originally relied on his president's birthday balls in order to fund the organization from very wealthy donors, these large donations, but demand for services from this organization outpaced his fundraising, and so he began to appeal for the general public for donations. I'm reading a quote here from this History.com article. At one fundraiser, celebrity singer Eddie Cantor jokingly urged the public to send dimes to the president, coining the term March of Dimes. The public took his appeal seriously, flooding the White House with more than 2 million dimes and thousands of dollars in donations. And from this was born the organization March of Dimes. So this National Foundation for Infantile Paralysis became March of Dimes, which we still know today. In 1941, the organization funded the development of an improved iron lung for polio patients. And then in 1945, the March of Dimes appointed Jonas Salk as researcher for a polio vaccine, which was eventually developed in 1949, 4 years after the president's death. March of Dimes continues to fight prenatal and early childhood diseases through support programs and research. Of course, with the vaccine for polio, it is no longer necessary that they spend all of their time supporting people with polio, so have pivoted to largely prenatal and very early childhood diseases. And FDR remains on the dime today, which was another significant outcome of this March of Dimes campaign. Another interesting note is that early on in his recovery, Roosevelt became very interested in a site called Warm Springs, Georgia, when he heard about a boy regaining use of his legs through a hydrotherapy in the area's mineral-rich waters. Roosevelt first visited Warm Springs in 1924 and bought the property in 1927 and really converted it into a polio rehabilitation hub, both for himself and for others. He spent 16 weeks there during his presidency and was there in what he had built and coined the Little White House when he died in 1945. Today, the site is still a rehab center for amputees, people with spinal cord injuries, stroke patients, and those with brain damage, and it is currently operated as a rehabilitation site by the state of Georgia. And so while he remained in a wheelchair, never really regained use of his legs, this belief that this warm weather and vigorous exercise could heal him led him to purchase this Warm Springs site and open it up for others with disabilities. And this was initially funded and operated by the March of Dimes organization. As far as his policy and how it may or may not have been affected by his disability, one thing that comes to mind is the Social Security Act. FDR had originally envisioned this to be a larger than it was in his initial iteration. And the original Social Security Act that Roosevelt signed into law in 1935 did not include a provision specifically for people with disabilities. It was exclusively for the aging population, but it did lay the groundwork for a platform on which the addition could be built later. Upon signing the Social Security Act, Roosevelt said, "We can never ensure 100% of the population against 100% of the hazards and vicissitudes of life, but we have tried to frame a law which will give some measure of protection to the average citizen and to his family against the loss of a job and against poverty-ridden old age." And so in even signing the Social Security Act, he acknowledged that it hadn't gone quite as far to provide the protection for the American people that he had wanted, but it was a start and something that I believe was informed by his own disability and his support that he received upon being paralyzed and his desire for others to have access to that sort of support.
Now, Rachel, I know you're going to be talking in a moment about Lewis Howe and his role in all of this, but I was wondering if you wanted to talk about some of the things that we've hit on today, FDR's early career and his disability, before you go on to that.
Yeah, I think it's really interesting that his early career, kind of as an anti-corruption candidate, really has gotten overshadowed by his later career. But I think it's really worth noting because his early anti-corruption campaigning really did get him into contact with people that really helped him throughout his career. Lewis Howe, who I'll be touching on later, and it's really I wish we knew more about, or it was more talked about, his early career, because I think it did. It's really interesting, the lessons learned. The Irish American and German American voters just overwhelmingly boycotting or crossing over to vote Republican. That's really fascinating and something I had never learned about before. And also just how he actually had to crawl back from humiliating defeat, and how that happened, I think is a really interesting lesson that could be learned, but it just is so completely overshadowed by his post-polio career and his comeback and his wild popularity as president. But I think there's more value in learning about his initial defeats.
Could you tell us about one of the instrumental figures in all of this, both his early career, his recovery, his political comeback, and then his presidency?
Yeah, as I mentioned, Lewis Howe was a figure that really was instrumental in Roosevelt's success. He was a writer for the New York Herald, and that's how he met Roosevelt back in his early career. Howe, it's interesting to note that Howe was sickly and fragile as a child. He suffered from asthma and was generally kept home by his parents, and he never grew to more than 5 feet tall. So he kind of had a background in being the convalescent patient, and I think that really helped him aid and help Roosevelt throughout his recovery after his bout with polio. Lewis Howe actually helped FDR through 2 major illnesses, both his bout with polio and also a previous case of typhoid fever in 1912. And this was occurring during FDR's re-election campaign for New York State Senator. Howe actually took over the campaign in the final 6 weeks, and he swept FDR to a victory even greater than his initial election. He had a very strong letter writing campaign. He made an effort to go into rural districts and really connect with voters there. So he really was pretty much responsible for FDR's sweeping victory. During FDR's attack of polio, Howe took on more of a caretaker role, much more than his actual relations did, like Eleanor or his mother. He kept Roosevelt's spirits up, and he took on more of the political aspect of Roosevelt's career as well. He was the one that encouraged secrecy surrounding Roosevelt's paralysis, and this is probably the origin of the mythology of concealment, because Howe did initially lie to the public about whether the disability would be permanent. So one really vital aspect in Howe's assistance to Roosevelt's political career was his encouragement of Roosevelt giving the 1924 presidential convention nominating speech. It was a chance for him to show the public that while he was definitely permanently disabled, he was still able to conduct his political career. And they did slightly obscure how severe the disability was. Both Howe and Eleanor did encourage Roosevelt to make the speech, and Roosevelt made a very what was considered heroic at the time walk across the stage. He was aided with crutches and in the company of his son James. And this kind of inspirational walk across the stage to give the speech really revitalized his political career and made him look like a viable candidate once more. It's kind of interesting today. I think it would be kind of derided as quote unquote inspiration porn, just showing that while he was disabled, he was able to kind of live a quote unquote normal life and walk, even if it was aided with crutches. It's kind of interesting to see what that looks like from modern eyes versus how it looked like at the time.
Kelley, I think that this speech is sort of captures a lot of the points that you made earlier, which is first of all, he's himself not giving up on the idea that eventually he's going to be fine. So he's just on the permanent road to recovery rather than being permanently disabled. And then secondly, that they were disclosing that he had this disability, but it was always framed in terms of that he was A, doing better than he actually was, and B, that he was, again, in the process of overcoming it. Is that how you sort of read this walk across the stage in 1924 as well?
Yeah, absolutely. It is evident in this walk across the stage and his referral to himself as a sort of a champion over what ailed him. And I do think there is I do think in many ways he is a champion. Like he got this disease at 39 years old and then became president. So there is certainly a success narrative here, and I don't want to undermine that. The success just wasn't so much on regaining use of his legs. And that is something that he seemed unwilling to admit either in the public eye or in private spaces.
And Rachel, I think what is your take as well, given the modern perspective on these things in terms of his, I mean, I guess as Kelley said, it partly has to do with just his own perception of himself, right? But like this idea of framing himself as this inspiration, it's like, well, he was inspirational. He did overcome these things. He did become president. Like, that's pretty incredible. But also, he was clearly framing it in a certain way, intentionally.
Yeah. I think it is heroic because he was able to use his influence to shine a spotlight on the childhood victims of polio, kind of giving them a voice that they didn't have. So I think that was pretty heroic of him. And he was, I mean, even if his efforts were thwarted in regards to like Social Security, he did lay the groundwork for the eventual expansion of Social Security and disability payments and support for people with disabilities. So I think we can take inspiration, but maybe not in the way that he intended at the time, just because he did give a voice to people, whether because of or despite his kind of insistence on walking or standing or putting on this veneer of overcoming his disability.
Any other thoughts from either of you on any of this?
I think it is interesting that there is kind of a debate on what he actually had, but at the same time, it's pretty much irrelevant because he was so shaped by the naming of it as polio that I don't know that it would actually really elucidate anything if we did eventually learn what he may have actually had.
I'm in the camp that thinks he had Guillain-Barré and never had polio, but I'm also not an expert on this. But I agree with you, which is one reason that I framed some of the notes around that way, which is that it doesn't matter what he actually had. It matters what everyone thought that he had, because that's how he responded accordingly. All right, Kelley, thank you for being on this week to talk about FDR's August 1921 paralysis 100 years ago this month.
Thank you for having me, Bill. Good to talk with you, Rachel.
And Rachel, thank you for coming on as well to talk about some of FDR's framing and political maneuvering around this part of his life.
Thanks for having me. It's always a pleasure.